I don't want to give Reagan too much power, but I think it's a whole set of ideologies and approaches that form the modern world, not just in the United States, but in the United Kingdom, in the European Union, and in the world at large. Even China, is quite Reaganite in some ways.
To understand geopolitics, you must have the freedom to be honest. The More Freedom Foundation podcast. How's your week been going, Rob?
Not too bad. No complaints. Back in New York City, enjoying it. Yourself?
Yeah, I'm all right. Just working away. What was your main takeaway from your trip?
It was fascinating. We might even get into it a little bit with what we're talking about. But it's just, I love driving around the United States and delving into the history of all these places. And they're certainly different in a lot of ways, but they're the same in a lot of ways. And one of the things that was most impressive to me, or maybe just an indicator of where my thought space is recently, is just how important government was to the development of everything in this country. You go to a town, Oklahoma's particularly crazy like this. The entire place was populated over a decade by land rushes that were organized by the government. They took the land, they assigned plots of land.
Didn't they literally have races? Whoever was first got a certain plot?
They did. They were able to do that in Oklahoma specifically because it was largely the last sort of bit of unallotted terrain. That's not correct. There's a lot of government land, but a lot of that government land is intentionally...
Doesn't it tend to be less government land the more west you go?
No, there's much more government land the further west you go. Yes, sorry. So the further east...
Because it was like people had come mostly from Europe and they'd claimed that land, and then the government wanted to have more control kind of once people were coming to the other side. Isn't generally that's how it went?
I think that there's just so much more of it out there and so much less of it is useful. A lot of it
is New Mexico.
Yeah, there's a lot of desert, there's a lot of mountain ranges. And if you just look at the population distribution, if you look at like a heat map of the population distribution of the United States, there's still vastly more people on the east side of the Mississippi. So it's just, to some extent, the land hasn't been allocated yet, and there probably wouldn't necessarily be that much demand for it. There's not a lot of folks in modern cities who want to go out and do some homesteading,
And there was a lot of nuclear testing in Nevada and similar states, which I don't think many people keen to have.
True. There's some of that. There's some of that for sure. But what's interesting about Oklahoma was that it was kind of the last place that was seen as sort of frontierish, mostly because it was the last place that was decided to be stolen from the Native Americans. It was actually known as Indian territory for most of the 19th century. That was where everybody got displaced to, and then the U.S. government eventually decided that wasn't enough, so we'll take that as well. But it's not just about allocating land. It's about the railways that knit the country together before the automobile were very much created out of government programs, government grants. And there were experiments with full-throated capitalism with those companies that led to a lot of company failure and a lot of abuses, so they became heavily regulated. In the era of the automobile, what I was using to get from place to place in the United States was the interstate highway system, which is... in my more libertarian days, I saw as this sinister plot to control states because of all the money involved in the interstate highway system. And you know what? As I've gotten older and less libertarian, I've come to acknowledge that actually, yes, the control that the interstate highway system exerts is probably a good thing. But my broader point is this is all government. And bit by bit, the history of the 19th century is extraordinary because government was sort of their sports. It was their sports and entertainment, at least in the United States in the 19th century. Amount of attention and the amount of effort that a much broader, I don't want to oversell it, but a broader slice of the public put into politics and government and what should we do and what should we do next, it seems it's a foreign country the more I read about it.
Were there any weird and wonderful parties from that time that you have a soft spot for?
Oh, political parties that I have a soft spot for? They're also foreign. They're also
Okay. Is that where the original populism came from?
well, it's that's a fraud topic. We're
I
talking.
know I think the definitions change now, but I think it was a wee bit more democratic back then.
I've read enough about sort of prairie agrarianism or farmer politics and populism. I've read enough about it to say that I don't quite understand it. But regardless, that whole era and traveling through it, and that's what you do when you drive around the Midwest, is you drive around the physical remnants of that era and how it thought about government and what U.S. history was. Really sort of threw up a contrast for me to what I want to talk about today, which is the way that we view the world right now and how that relates to AI, to artificial intelligence. So what we're doing is we're doing a two-parter. First, we're going to talk about what I believe is at the root of our current view of the world, which is just generally Reaganism. I don't want to give Reagan too much power, but I think it's a whole set of ideologies and approaches that form the modern world, not just in the United States, but in the United Kingdom, in the European Union, and in the world at large. Even China, is quite Reaganite in some ways. And I want to talk about how that relates to AI, because I think it's a really unexamined topic, and I think it's worth doing a two-parter on this. We talk about bias in artificial intelligence. That's becoming a very hot topic. The idea that these systems employed by businesses and governments, and as they become employed by businesses and governments more, the chances of them coming to decisions that are unfair or racist or even illegal because they're just robots, ticking boxes, is very high and is a very real concern. These AI tools are trained on the data that we give them, and the data that we give them is very faulty. So I think people are doing the really valuable work of trying to examine racial bias, other kinds of biases in AI work. But I think it's the political bias that people aren't paying enough attention to. Whether you believe artificial intelligence is going to go instant Terminator and take over the world within the next 6 months, or whether you just believe that it's going to fundamentally change a lot of ways that we work and think about things along the same lines as, say, the personal computer or the internet did. And it is somewhere in that range. It's not going to be as much of a nothing burger as crypto has been. It's already changing things in very serious ways. But wherever you come down on that, the importance of the era within which these technologies are begun and launch and start to affect us is, I think, under discussed. And I think it's really impossible to discuss artificial intelligence, these industries more generally, without discussing where we are as a society, where we are as a world. And I believe that is very rooted in the character of Ronald Reagan and the people around him and the people who followed him in political power, not just in the United States, but all over the world, and not just in government, but also in business. I think there was a real shift in the world view of the English-speaking world, at least, and I believe it filtered out to other folks, that happened in the late 1970s, the early 80s, and has just been gathering steam ever since. So with part one, I'd like to talk about that shift in worldview, the shift to Reaganism, for lack of a better word, Ronald Reagan, the president of the United States from 1981 to 1989. And then in part two, I'd like to talk a little bit more broadly about AI more generally and sort of artificial intelligence, what have you. And I think that they'll filter in different ways. But that's the agenda for this episode and next episode. And let's dive into it. What do you say, Ray?
I think that sounds like a brilliant idea. and might even overlap with Murdoch at some point.
Of course, of course. You prepared to do an episode on Rupert Murdoch?
Yes, Rory's wires got crossed. I could do with an AI myself.
Well, there you go.
But Murdoch is a massive fan of Ronald Reagan, and why do you think that is?
Why is Rupert Murdoch a massive fan of Ronald Reagan? The base reason is very simple. Rupert Murdoch is a rich person. Reaganism more generally has been indisputably phenomenal for the wealthy, has been a tremendous gift to folks who make money, have money. Most importantly, I would argue, have money. I think that part of the marketing, as we talk a lot about the potential for entrepreneurs to do incredibly well, and I think it's debatable, it's arguable that under Reaganism, sort of from the 1980s on, that entrepreneurs did have a broader scope than they did under the sort of New Deal dispensation. I think it's, if you look at the broader class of the wealthy, it's not really about brilliant entrepreneurs. It is about folks who have money and figure out how to use that money to make more money. We celebrate everywhere we can every example of somebody who is a self-made person or has brought themselves up by their bootstraps. But as we've sort of realized by certain social media focuses on nepo babies or what have you, nepotism babies, have you heard this?
Yeah.
A lot of those examples of self-made people really aren't necessarily that self-made.
Well, I think it focused on actors, didn't it? That nepo babies. I just think it's interesting. Actors is one of those things that opens a lot of doors, but if you can't act, people hate you and you quickly disappear. While I feel nepotism in other fields where middle management or, you inherit a business, it's much easier to get away with nepotism in those fields.
That's an excellent point. And obviously a much broader issue. Rich people tend to have rich children. That's just sort of how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And in different...
and well-connected children.
And yes, and well-connected children. And for one sort of a bright, shining era, there was a point in U.S. politics, and I think world politics more generally, in the aftermath of the Great Depression, World War II, just those traumas of the 20th century, about 3-4 decades after World War II, there were slightly fewer avenues for nepo babies to do very well. Estate taxes were higher, income taxes were higher. There was a more aggressive government positioning against monopoly and those sorts of sources of power. And what Reaganism in a lot of ways was about was sweeping that away, that moment after World War II, when we had rampaging economic growth that also managed to be extraordinarily equal, unprecedentedly equal in historical terms. And what the Reaganism, Reagan-Thatcherism, neoliberalism more generally was fundamentally about was sweeping that away, I think in French they actually called them the 30 glorious years after World War II, where all the boats were rising, everything was going well. Now, I don't want to oversell this. I don't want to come across as some kind of rampant lefty. The fact is that things weren't going so well in the 1970s. The New Deal model had run into a variety of problems, very serious problems. There were, Nixon had to abandon the gold standard. There was stagflation. There were all kinds of serious issues. I do, in my latter intellectual development, I begin to question how many of those issues were more about the oil crisis than they were about actual problems with the New Deal model. But that's a very open argument.
Well, you can't let any crisis go to waste.
Exactly. And I think Naomi Klein has written a series of books on exactly that argument, just sort of disaster capitalism and what have you. But regardless, I'm pretty up in the air about that. I think it was clear to many people that the governing dispensation, economically, politically, what have you, had run out of steam in the 1970s.
But has Reaganism now sort of run out of steam in the same sense? It's run its course?
I would certainly make that argument. I make that argument on the channel. I think that we can definitely say that that's the case, that we're sort of running on fumes. The fact, I mean, the best example of that would be that in 2020, we had a really horrific prospect of two sort of septuagenarians babbling at each other in the U.S. presidential race. And in 2024, at this point, as of this recording, the chances of the same two babbling septuagenarians running against each other doing a rerun in 2024, where at least one of them will be a babbling octogenarian, is a great, for me, and I do want to dial it back a little bit. I don't want to come across as sort of like this rampaging leftist, but I do think that there is a real need to go back to certain aspects of that New Deal period of time. And I do think that in certain decades, in the 1980s and the 1990s, Reaganism did provide a service. You do need to go through different phases, emphasize different things in a system, in a world system, in a government system, in a country, in different times. You need to try new things. And in the 1980s and the 1990s, the answers that the Reaganites offered worked pretty well, is my understanding, both in the United States and more broadly. The problem is we reached diminishing returns a long, long time ago. I would argue probably 15, 20 years ago, we reached the point of diminishing returns. The problem is that folks have just fallen into this way of thinking about the world, have not had any, there are so many people who simply don't know anything different any longer. So
but also change would affect the ones that are the most powerful currently, which is these mega corporations. Like I've heard that Apple might be about to completely change the banking system because it just has so much money that it currently owns instead of having to lend other people's money.
That sounds entirely credible to me. My understanding is that they started offering savings accounts, Apple, to some degree. On Apple Pay,
they're going to have a much larger interest rate, so everyone's going to be like, why should I keep with you when Apple's giving me 4%, 5%?
Exactly. Another Apple news story, I'm not sure how accurate this is, over the past couple of weeks, is that on some measures, the Apple itself has a larger market cap than every United Kingdom public company combined.
Yeah, I could believe that.
Yeah, which is, and basically allowing Apple to, and that's a great example, right? So allowing Apple to just then, with the amount of power and money it already has, just move on and take over the entire banking industry, allows us, puts us into a new and troubling era. And what's interesting is that not just in the New Deal era, sort of post-World War II up until, the Great Depression, World War II up until the 1970s, but for all of the history of the United States and all of the history of modern state systems, in Europe at least, going back to the 1500s, an Apple would not be allowed to exist.
Mm-hmm.
That level of power would have been seen as obviously inappropriate to give to any one company. And this isn't socialism, this isn't rampant leftism or something like that. That's just basic democratic principles that would have seemed completely natural to slave-owning founding fathers of the United States. That would have seemed completely natural to all political spectrums of the United States up until about 1970 or so, is that you shouldn't have a company that is this all-powerful and doesn't just absorb companies, absorbs whole industries.
Mm-hmm.
But because of this Reaganite ideology that we have adopted over the past now 45 years, very few people are willing to say that. Very few people are willing to be like, oh, hey, that doesn't seem like a smart thing to do. And I for the absolute center, I think, of the Reaganite ideology, specifically related to artificial intelligence, to AI, I think is probably just a simple phrase, just 4 words, which is, we have no control.
Mm.
We can't we can't do it. Well, Apple's just going to do what they're going to do. We can't do anything about that. AI, gosh, it takes billions of dollars, probably conceivably trillions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars of computing equipment, and very complex organizations to build these artificial intelligence models. But there's just really nothing we can do about that. It's gonna, the private, the private sector is just gonna do that because that's what the private sector does. And I'm not someone who's necessarily advocating shutting down any kind of AI research. I'm not particularly threatened by it. Don't really believe the folks who are like, oh, well, if we don't have a 6-month pause, the world's going to end. I don't believe in that sort of thing. But the general sense that we can't do anything about it, that's Reaganism. I think that's one of the most important aspects, is just this idea that government can't really do anything. The point of government is...
But when someone publishes secret documents on Discord, the FBI is there pretty quick.
Yeah. But yeah, I think just that idea that the government has no valid purpose other than to sell and use extraordinarily expensive weapon systems. I think that's at the heart of Reaganism. Do you think I think maybe we should back up a little bit and just talk a little bit about Ronald Reagan specifically, because he's just one guy. And I do feel that it is a bit much to pin all of what's gone wrong in the past 45 years on this one guy. He's a symbol, is what Ronald Reagan is.
Was he a bit of a useful idiot at times? As in, he was a soft touch and it was easy for big companies to manipulate him?
I think that's certainly by the end of his time as president. It's funny, he was, by his second term, he was probably young. I don't have it in front of me. He was probably younger than Biden was in his first, but he's pretty widely recognized to have been already declining mentally by the time he was president. And I think the sort of image of him is this sort of avuncular, is that the right word? This sort of benevolent, goofy grandfather figure who got pushed around a little bit. I think that's certainly how he's most known, but I think he knew what he was about. I mean, he was a hardcore Cold Warrior. He was a very talented politician. I think that the image of him as just sort of a pawn of other forces has elements of truth to it, for sure, but I think is unfairly exaggerated by how in decline he was in his last years as president. He, I believe, started out as a Hollywood actor. Then...
Yeah, well, he jokes that he wasn't even that good. He was like a B-tier actor.
The Gipper or something like that. I think that was one of his most famous. He's like, I think, a football star who's dying of something and says,
someday when the team's up against it, breaks are beating the boys, ask them to go in there with all they've got. Win just one for the Gipper.
Yeah, he was sort of a B actor, and he became significant in California politics, I believe, actually through union politics initially. He was the head of the...
Interesting.
He had some relationship to the Screen Actors Guild, the union for actors, and I think he was virulently anti-communist. Might have... I don't know the exact details there, but...
Didn't he help weed out other potential communists, which just tended to mean slightly left and not very
I haven't dived in on his history recently, but I think he this could be vaguely libelous to say it if it's not true, but I do have a sense he may have named names or whatever, which is like a horrible thing.
You can't libel the dead.
Yeah, true enough. But I haven't gone into the minutia of that. But he moved from there to being a sort of proud paid corporate spokesman who would travel the country. I think it was on behalf of GE, giving more or less political speeches, talking about how business was being trampled by the New Deal, which I think is to some degree accurate. There was, and not necessarily a terrible thing when you consider how well business did out of the wars and out of the Gilded Age before it. But that was sort of what he did. And then he was able to move into California politics and politics on a national stage. It's fascinating that even up to the point that he was elected, his views of things, his approach to the world was seen as radical and nutty. And it was sort of...
And now it's considered blasé.
Yeah. Oh, sure. Even Rhino, you know, I mean, he was very pro-immigration. Certainly, his views that seemed incredibly radical in the 1970s would seem milquetoast to the conservatives of today. But I think we can go too far in blaming everything on Reagan personally. I think he was the guy who symbolized the victory of this new ideology, this new way of looking at things, this fundamentally pro-business, anti-government worldview or outlook. But if you look at the details of his governance, there were aspects that were not just the defense budget, there were aspects of his governance that were fairly big government. There are also aspects of this Reaganite switch, this switch to emphasis on business and deregulation, that date back to Jimmy Carter's time. These were ideas that were already percolating. And in the period of Jimmy Carter's presidency, when things really appeared to be falling apart, Carter was willing to try everything. I believe airline deregulation started under Carter. Carter's the guy who appointed Paul Volcker to the head of the Federal Reserve, who basically tamed the dollar with high interest rates or what have you. And Democratic presidents would also qualify as Reaganites in my eyes.
Well, definitely Clinton.
Oh, for sure. Welfare reform was his biggest accomplishment. I should put that in air quotes as well. He balanced the budget. That was supposedly, it never has been, but has supposedly been a Republican priority. And Barack Obama, his signature lefty Democratic priority was Obamacare, which is fundamentally a way to give insurance companies more money. And it did expand coverage in the United States for sure, but it also did so by making insurance companies...
It's a very pro-business way of doing it.
The most pro-business way imaginable. And that's just the world that we've been living in for the past 40 years in the United States and more broadly. It's funny, in my more conservative days, I viewed the European Union as this incredibly socialistic, commie institution.
Yeah.
And having lived in Turkey and, spent some time going through, it was the acquis communautaire or what have you, the requirements.
You realize how capitalistic it is.
Yes, the requirements.
Well, there is this sort of German form of capitalism where you still try your best to look after the worker.
Sure.
You want your worker to turn up to work, so good transport. You want them to be healthy, so good health care. You could argue it in a capitalistic fashion. Oh. But America seems to sort of want to, privatize everything.
I like that as the distinction between the European and American capitalist systems. They're very similar. It's just in Europe they want their workers to stay alive. In the U.S., it's more negotiable.
Yeah.
And it's sort of...
Sadly.
But no question, there are certain aspects of European capitalism that are more socialistic. But this era, the sort of 70s, 80s, also pushed all of those countries, even Germany with its famously negotiated pro-labor approach to things, more further in the direction of... they don't call it Reaganism over there. They'd maybe call it neoliberalism is sort of the catch-all term over there.
Yes.
So everybody was sort of pushed in these directions. I mean, the Chinese Communist Party became incredibly pro-business.
Well, I think that had to do with a certain Soviet Union not being about anymore.
True enough. But I think Deng was already pushing things in that direction. In 1979 sticks in my head as sort of the beginning.
One of the stars on the Chinese flag symbolizes sympathetic capitalists.
Oh, I didn't know that. That's fascinating. Isn't there a word for what a flag, the study of flags?
It's not vexillology, is it?
I think it is. Yeah, you're right. Vexillology.
It's one of those things you only see it, so you don't know how it's pronounced.
Yeah, I don't go in for vexillology. I can't even.
Oh, you're not a big fan of C.G.P. Grey?
Everybody loves C.G.P. Grey.
Oh, he did one. He ranked all the U.S. state flags.
Oh, fascinating. I haven't.
He really likes the New Mexico flag.
I love that guy uploads a video twice a year and gets 10 million views on every single one of them.
He does craft.
He's good at his job. Plus a bit of that first mover advantage that he's definitely.
Definitely
cherished and used well.
So what businesses use their first mover advantage with Reaganism?
Oh, that's a great question. Banks. Generally, banks. banks. Finance has done extraordinarily well under Ronald Reagan. And that's sort of an interesting thing to point to. Like the big successes of this Reaganite era are things like Citibank, or is it Citigroup, whatever it is now. Just these Goldman Sachs, these sort of financial titans where if you tried to point to something they actually did, it's mostly just almost blow up the world economy in 2008. There's not much you can point to here. Whereas the FDR period, the sort of the post-World War II era, you've got rocket ships to the moon, you've got the whole array of consumer goods titans, brands that are omnipresent all over the world. Some of these companies are older, of course, than that era, but, Coca-Cola became a worldwide brand, McDonald's, all manner of large companies, whereas...
And large-scale government projects as well.
Yes, exactly. There's a lot to show for that sort of FDR era, including the interstate highway system I was using on my road trip. And that was a Republican president, Eisenhower, but that was very much within the FDR era because that was that approach to things. The we have no control, we can't do anything mantra of the Reagan era hadn't yet come in. So finance has been an incredible winner, despite the fact it hasn't really provided much. And tech are sort of the big winners. And that's indisputable. I think, though, that's actually probably to some degree a success story of the Reagan era, is the ability of companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon to create new things that are of...
But did they not also work with government? I remember in the early days, IBM was given something the American government created, like one of the very early microchips. And it was like, oh, we're finished with this. Here's some free technology for you. It feels like it's very much... They're very quick to, criticize the government, but are very happy to take all the handouts they get.
Absolutely. And that's a huge dynamic ongoing in pharma specifically. The amount of research and money that is poured out by the federal government every year is immense. I would argue it's half to a third smaller than it should be, but it's still tens to hundreds of billions of dollars every year. And a lot of that intellectual property just sort of gets reformatted and handed off to these big pharma companies that then charge the United States consumer obscene amounts while booking all their profits in Ireland or what have you.
Because I've heard there is an overlap generally. Universities and colleges are very good at developing the drugs, and then industry is very good at making a billion of them. So there is a balance, but it does seem to be definitely with America. They are the private sector's doing a lot better out of it.
But that's another great example of the sort of Reaganism, the sort of Reagan era. I don't want to get into the minutia of arguments about COVID vaccines or what have you, but I think you could make a solid argument that 40 years ago, 50 years ago, in a situation as perilous for the world as COVID, there's no way we would have allowed Moderna and Pfizer to make as much money off of the vaccines as they did.
Because I'm thinking smallpox, the disease, when it was wiped out, was there a huge amount of profits made for private companies?
No. My understanding is no. And to be clear, some profits would have been made by Pfizer and Moderna, but just this
a sensible balance. There seems to just be a vulgar amount of profits at the moment.
Yes, a vulgar amount of profits everywhere. The government tech thing, though, is interesting because, and this is the vestiges, and this is coming into the 1990s. There were still people in the Department of Justice in the United States that still believed that there should be competition in things. But the only reason that Microsoft exists and Apple, I think to some extent that Apple exists, is because of 1960s and 1970s government action against IBM, which is the company that was the computer industry at that point. And the U.S. government stepped in and said, no, you're going to have to They didn't actually. I don't think they did actually break up AT&T. I don't believe they actually broke up IBM, but there were like consent decrees or something. I think there were things they had to do to sort of satisfy that. And one of the things they did was unbundle operating systems, which allowed Microsoft to exist. In the 1990s, Microsoft came under the scrutiny.
They kind of saved Apple because they had to, because they were becoming a monopoly.
Oh, I don't know about the details of that, but I'm talking about government action. In the 1990s, the Department of Justice, I think it was the Department of Justice, or maybe it's I don't know. There's so many different redundant agencies that should be doing this kind of work in the United States. But there was a case against Microsoft, and Microsoft was required to unbundle. I think it had something to do with the browser at that point, but at the dawn of the internet era...
Yes, the Netscape and stuff.
Yes, the Netscape stuff. But at the dawn of the internet, the U.S. government told Microsoft that there needs to be a scope for other competition here, and this is why Google, Facebook, and Amazon exist. So that's just another example of, like, there's always a give and take here. The problem... So the government bureaucrats and attorneys that brought about that result... in the 1990s, they're not working any longer if they're still alive. I mean, some of them are, but the institutions that remembered in the 1990s that it was good to have competition, that there was a world where government could do things, those folks are largely out of government, and it's a sort of mental reflex that I have, and I've had to like struggle against a lot. And I think actually going from a pretty diehard right-winger to somebody who questions that orientation towards things has allowed me to see a little bit more just how everything we consume, every public policy issue we discuss is suffused with this assumption that government is useless, that only business knows how to solve anything, that only markets know how to handle stuff. So it's not shocking at all that we get to this dawn of artificial intelligence, and nobody has any idea how, we could conceivably put any kind of leash on any of this stuff. And I think it's a real problem, and it's setting the initial conditions for an industry that has the potential to be revolutionary and to have like its DNA and its mental sense of everything to be so fundamentally Reaganite is a real problem.
So a common question for ChatGPT is, how can I make money? How can I make a business and all this? It just feels like it's, Reagan still chatting away to you.
Exactly. And I think there's certain ways in which this influence is really obvious. Like the Elon Musk has recently revealed himself to be, and like the clutch of reactionary venture capitalists that he's hangs out with, or at least that celebrates him. Was it David Sachs or Jason Calacanis or Chamath? I can't pronounce either of his names, and I apologize for that. These are that sort of group of people, and their embrace of cryptocurrency has always been pretty gross and pretty hyper-libertarian. Peter Thiel in a pretty gross way. And don't get me wrong, it's very troubling that a lot of these folks are the same folks who are going to play serious roles in the companies that create artificial intelligence. But it's not just them. It's not just the out there and vociferous types. It's all of us. It's just basic assumptions that we make about how the world should work. There are thousands, hundreds of thousands of good Democrats in this country that hate everything about Donald Trump and care about social justice and that Black Lives Matter and things that really matter and everything, but think that tax hikes are evil. They think that the idea that we would have tax rates that are 5% higher would be a complete deal breaker.
Oh, yeah, it's communism.
Yeah, it's communism, and would prompt everybody to vote for the Republicans. That's why, folks, the Republican Party is so desperate for a vaguely palatable, literate-sounding, non-openly racist candidate. And they know that as soon as they have one of those, they'll clean up again, because it's just the very idea that we would do basic things to make government work a little better, or do the most basic things to try to address this inequality problem that we have and that is growing, is just anathema. It seems sacrilegious and unimaginable in ways that it wouldn't to like a 1980s Republican, or even like a hardcore conservative in the 1980s wouldn't believe. And there's so much in our society that's just sort of set up that way. And it's easy to focus on Peter Thiel or like crazy rabid Republican one percenters, where actually I think the problem's much deeper than that. And it's an ideology and an approach to things that has been internalized with a much broader scope of the U.S. public.
But also a hatred of the unions. I've sort of thought anytime you watch American media and unions are brought up, it's never in a good light.
That's a huge part of it as well. I mean, the 1970s, you had a much higher rate of union participation.
Well, it was seen as a normal thing. Well, now it's almost like a sin.
Oh, it's a weird trend. It's coming back, unionization, but it's coming back the way vinyl is. It's like a fad. It's not a mass market thing anymore. And being anti-worker is a big part of Reaganism as well. And I think, just going back to my road trip, it's interesting that there are aspects. Not only are there aspects of Reaganism that are useful, there's still aspects of the U.S. economy that could use some deregulation, could use some free market stuff. I think probably zoning and housing are great examples of that. But not only are there aspects of Reaganism that are useful, there are aspects of Reaganism that do go back to the founding of the United States, that are like deeply part of the makeup of how things are. The United States has always been more hostile to labor than Europe has, and that's not great. But, and this was just really obvious to me going around the United States and just sort of like diving in a little bit to like the founding of all these cities and whatnot, and just but not as much as we think it is. Like the Reaganism is not as rooted in the U.S. history and U.S. psyche as we like to pretend it is. I think is.
Well, I think something that springs to mind is there's this idea of fighting off the Native Americans was like a part that, individuals did, that, the cowboy movies portray, but in reality it was the U.S. military.
Well,
it killed the vast majority of Native Americans. So there's this idea that, it was us on our own and we fought for this land, when it was the government.
Well, it was collective action is what it was. It was militias. And I think there's this hair splitting that a lot of folks like to do. It's like, oh, no, it's I think, is it voluntarism? I think, is that a species of libertarianism? It's like, oh, no, it's things we chose to do together, and like, that's not government. It's like, no, like, government is a thing that we choose to do together. And for the past 40 years, we have chosen to not do things. And to some extent, that was, a useful choice at some periods in the 1980s, in some sectors in the 1980s, 1990s. But as a broader philosophy that we've now all adopted, it's a real problem. And even completely aside from the artificial intelligence issue, like, it's a real problem for the country and the world. And I think people are recognizing that. I think it's becoming very clear, both in the United States and on the international level, that we're moving away from a lot of these free trade, free market orthodoxies that no longer seem to serve really anybody. So So I'm not saying it's hopeless, but what is a little legitimately scary about the artificial intelligence thing, and I talked about this potential with crypto stuff, is that we're at this sort of transitional period where most people sort of believe the old orthodoxies, that we can actually solidify these old orthodoxies through this technological adoption. Does that make sense? That like we're going to make choices with artificial intelligence based on the way that we will view the world today. And even though we should be moving on to a different way of viewing the world, we'll stop. We'll sort of freeze ourselves. So it's actually what I'm most worried about with AI isn't that things are just going to get so all far different all of a sudden that we can't handle things anymore. What I'm most worried about is that we're going to calcify and solidify some
So are you saying the AI's default mindset is Reaganism?
That's my exactly. That's exactly my concern. And it's less obvious.
So when you ask it a problem, and it's almost always saying, well, the private sector will help you out.
Exactly. And I think it's already I haven't played with ChatGPT that much, but I think that's already what it's doing, because a large language model, a chatbot is just one subset of these technologies, but that's an amazing example. It is built on, to some extent, what most people say and think. These LLMs are generated from the internet. That's the data set. And this is most answers to those questions for the entire age of the internet have been, yes, get the private, public choice theory, get the government out of there. It's the markets know best. I think Google has done some interesting work digitizing a lot of older books or what have you, but that's nothing compared to just the sheer volume of commentary on not just official commentary, but just people's comments on Reddit or Facebook posts or this, that, and the other thing. It's a sense of the world that was useful, is no longer useful, but is represented in the vast majority of written text.
And also, if you're asking in English, most of those texts will be, American-based, with being the dominant culture.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I don't know if this is true. We'll, I think more in the next episode, we'll dive into the technical aspects that I'm certainly not equal to. But it's kind of fascinating, the competition between sort of Chinese and U.S. AI is a big dynamic, a big geopolitical dynamic. And it's interesting to think about. The assumption for the longest period of time is like, oh, well, the Chinese will be able to do so much better because they have such unrestricted access to all of these data sets or what have you. But the weird thing is that the internet, as it grew, because it did grow in a time of such U.S. dominance, is if you live anywhere in the world and you wanted to participate in a lot of the internet, you wanted to do it in English. And that's just such an incredible, certainly when we're thinking about large language models, the ChatGPT stuff, the incredible head start that the English-speaking world has over, that massive Chinese population kind of looks like a backwater by comparison. It's kind of interesting.
But also, when it's translating things from other languages, it'll still almost be bringing it back to English like it's the norm.
Yeah.
So even if you are talking to it in another language, I'm always imagining like if, Brazilian tribes people were to use it, it's not going to talk to them like it knows them and, can process their daily life. It'll be talking like they're some New Yorker explaining things to them and just converting it to whatever language they happen to be speaking.
Yeah. It's an incredibly complicated, incredibly world-changing set of technologies that is just sort of setting its base cases for everything in a period of transition. And
Reaganite 2.0.
Yeah, so Reaganism forever. Just the immortal Reagan approach, and that's dangerous, as I think we have been seeing and will continue to see. Just and I just think a lot more time and thought needs to be, and analysis needs to be put in to the ways that these technologies that are going to have long histories are determined by the mental makeup of the period in which they're born.
And also, isn't the current writer's strike based around AI?
I believe so. And what a fascinating illustration of the significance of this on like a number of levels. I mean, there's the simple fact that they don't want their scripts to be written by robots, for sure. But also the fact that a lot of thought world, a lot of the internet that is being fed into these large language models that would be taking their jobs are generated from their work, not just directly from their work, but also from the impact that their work has had. I mean, just think of the omnipresence of Simpsons or Friends or Office references in the mental makeup of everybody writing on the internet for as long as there has been an internet.
But also your scripts will be up there, so you can just say, write it like this other writer. They can just basically steal your stuff and then apply it to whatever the next episode's to be.
Yeah, that's a really key point, and that's also has to do with Reaganite views towards data privacy and sort of intellectual property. And I used to be, and I think largely am pretty eager to be leery of copyright protections and what have you. But I've got to say, like, the AI thing is kind of...
Well, it's just smash and grab.
The AI stuff is just smash and grab? Yeah.
Well,
it's
pretty much just whatever. If it's on the internet, I'll take it. I know we're talking mostly about ChatGPT, but if you talk about the graphics models that make images, quite often it just looks like something from DeviantArt because it's just went there, nicked that style, and then recreated that in whatever you wanted.
Exactly. It's a Midjourney, right? That's the...
Midjourney, yeah, is one of the big ones.
Yeah, it's quite extraordinary just how much this stuff is self-reflexive. You know, it's sort of a problem because we don't want our jobs taken in the future, but it's also completely based on the jobs that we've already done. Consider the tool that we use to make me sound like I'm not in a submarine right now. It's an Adobe product that it's a Podcast Enhance or something like that.
Yeah.
I've now started using it on my videos. But the reason it's so great is because Adobe has been scraping the information from audio engineers and their practices over the past, 5 to 10 years that they've been offering the Creative Suite online mostly. And yeah, it's just using old work and rehashing it. And what's interesting is that IP, intellectual property, has changed over the past 10, 15 years in such a way as to make this kind of thing more okay. My understanding is this old 4-pronged test for copywriting or trademark infringement or what have you. And it's all been replaced over the past 10, 15 years by this idea that, well, as long as it's transformative, you can do whatever you want. And I used to thrill to this from a YouTube creator standpoint. I mean, my sense is that as long as I run a photograph through some filters and cut it up, technically I can use it according to the state-of-the-art copyright protection stuff. But that being the standard in the United States, that if it's transformative, that just basically means that absolutely no DeviantArt artist has a leg to stand on. Even if you go to ChatGPT and are like, write me a novel in the style of Stephen King, and publish that novel, as long as Stephen King's name isn't on it, I don't think you have, under current U.S. copyright law, I don't think Stephen King has a case.
Drake and The Weeknd are currently taking legal action against someone for creating fakes of their music, using their voices similar lyrics, mashing up something that sounds kind of like a weird, horrible B-side, but plausibly like them.
It's amazing.
Interesting times.
Yeah, very interesting times. And it's definitely caused me to re-examine a lot of my assumptions about things. There's this outfit called, I think, was it the Electronic? Anyway, there's a range of nonprofits and advocacy organizations sort of funded by internet folks that I've idolized for long periods of time. And then this AI thing comes up and I'm less excited about a lot of the advocacy that these organizations have done. Yes, absolutely. Free speech, of course, that sounds phenomenal. But the idea of keeping government out of any kind of regulation as to how those texts are used is also something that they're interested in. But it's like, well, wait a second. Like just because I don't want any limitation on free speech doesn't mean that I'm okay with all of everybody's speech being used to create these machines that can replace all writers. I mean, that doesn't necessarily seem like it's an okay thing. But I think the current Reaganite perspective on these things is that it is okay, and there's nothing we can do, and it's just natural. That's just the way things are going to be.
If business wants it, then it must be good.
Exactly, and I think that's a real, problem.
Because business has never done anything wrong.
Yeah. And don't get me wrong, I'm still pro-business. I'm still like a capitalist, but I think that we need to make some changes, as FDR did in the FDR era, to make capitalism work better. And I think this approach, it's frustrating because, back before 2008, we've already demolished a lot of the intellectual pillars of Reaganism. Back before 2008, a lot of people believed in this thing called the efficient market hypothesis, which was that, markets were just right and markets were where they were supposed to be. We're now to a point where there is no self-respecting economist who would attempt to sell you that anymore. 2008 pretty much demolished that intellectual cul-de-sac. But a lot of that ideology is left in the way that we operate. There's no sensible economist who attempts to defend that any longer. This idea that markets are just naturally virtuous and naturally know the right thing and are perfect or whatever.
And there's no externalities.
Yeah, nobody defends that proposition any longer. But a lot of our regulatory, political, and just like mental frameworks are still based on that idea, And that's probably Reaganism at its roots. And we need to move beyond that before we start calcifying a new approach to everything that AI may be offering.
Getting into the 21st century proper.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's always fun, the periodization of history.
Decades and
it's all
centuries.
It's all arbitrary. And I'm sure 50 years from now or 100 years from now, that's incredibly, I'm pretty sure nobody will be looking at my YouTube channel. But if they were, they might find it ridiculous to see a distinction between FDR and Reaganism. They'll be like, oh, well, no, what was really going on in the late 20th century and early 21st century was this instead. Da, 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 da. And who knows, maybe some of that periodization will be about technologies that we developed. And maybe this whole internet thing from the 90s until the 2010s, and will just be seen as like a preliminary opening act to the era of LLMs and artificial intelligence.
Just like the 1930s.
I mean, who knows? Who knows? It's hopefully not like the 1930s. The Great Depression is definitely something I'd like to avoid repeating.
The More Freedom Foundation is also available on YouTube and TikTok. Rob's Twitter is RobOLaw, and he's also written a book called Avoiding the British Empire: What It Was and How the US Can Do Better. And music provided by Kevin MacLeod.